It was a Wednesday morning, and the usual hum of the factory floor was interrupted by a sound that made my blood run cold. A deafening crash followed by panicked shouts. I was standing in the break room when the noise reached me, and I immediately knew something had gone wrong. My heart pounded as I sprinted toward the source of the chaos. The scene that greeted me was nothing short of a nightmare. Equipment was strewn about, and a cloud of dust hung heavily in the air. Through the haze, I saw the twisted form of Stanley Wright, the man who had been the cause of my unraveling world, lying motionless on the ground. He had been working high up on the scaffold when it had collapsed, sending him crashing down with a sickening thud. The emergency alarms blared, and the factory erupted into a frenzy of activity. My hands shook as I tried to maintain my composure, knowing full well that this was no ordinary accident. Stanley was now at the center of it all, and for me, it was a twisted symphony of retribution coming to life. I watched as paramedics hurried to his side, their faces etched with concern. Stanley's once impeccably groomed appearance was now marred by blood and dirt. His suit, a symbol of his arrogance and power, was ripped and stained. I could see the jagged lines of his injury and the pained grimace on his face even from a distance. As they lifted him onto the stretcher and rushed him away, a murmur spread among the onlookers. Questions hung in the air, but I remained silent, watching through a veil of guilt and satisfaction. Stanley's fall was not just a physical descent, it was a metaphor for his impending downfall. This was the moment I had orchestrated, an accident that would unravel not just his life but everything he held dear. The shadows of my plans began to stir, and as the factory returned to its routine, a new kind of silence settled over me. It was the calm before the storm, the beginning of a chain reaction that would forever alter the course of our lives. It's strange how the smallest things can become the sharpest edges in the fabric of your life. I was rummaging through the cluttered drawer in our bedroom, looking for my phone charger, when my fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of paper. It wasn't the typical mess of receipts and old notes, this was something more. I unfolded the paper with a growing sense of dread. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, confident strokes spelling out a message from Stanley Wright. It was brief, just a few lines, but it conveyed more than words ever could. Can't wait to see you tonight. I'm thinking of our little secret. Let's make it unforgettable. A chill ran down my spine as I read it over and over, trying to make sense of it. The drawer, once a simple storage space, had become a Pandora's box. I glanced around the room, my mind racing to piece together the fragments of a reality I had been too blind to see. The signs had been there, I just hadn't wanted to see them. Laura's late nights, the sudden secrecy with her phone, her evasive responses. Each one had seemed like a minor issue. A quirk in our routine. But now, as I looked at that note, the pieces fell into place with a clarity that was both crushing and undeniable. I remembered the conversation we'd had a few weeks ago when I tried to address my suspicions. She had brushed me off with a laugh, telling me I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. I had wanted to believe her, to trust that our marriage was strong enough to weather any storm. But in that moment, standing in our bedroom with Stanley's note in hand, the illusion shattered. The room felt colder now, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The knowledge that my wife had been involved with Stanley, a man I had once respected, cut deeper than I could have imagined. My heart pounded with a mix of betrayal and anger, but there was also a strange sense of resolution. I knew now that my world had been turned upside down, and the path forward was no longer a matter of choice but of necessity. As I crumpled the note and shoved it back into the drawer, I knew that things would never be the same. The foundations of my life had been shaken, and the road to retribution was beginning to unfold. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon, and I was lounging on the couch, trying to distract myself with mindless scrolling through social media. I had been unable to sleep, tormented by the note I'd found and the nagging suspicions that had since taken root in my mind. My thumb hovered over the screen as I clicked through a series of posts. Most were mundane, trivial updates from acquaintances and friends. But then, my eyes fell on a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a snapshot posted by Laura's friend, Amanda, who had tagged Laura and Stanley in the picture. In the photo, Laura and Stanley were laughing together at what appeared to be a casual get-together, probably one of those unforgettable nights Stanley had alluded to. They were seated close together, their faces lit up with genuine joy. The kind of joy that was supposed to be reserved for shared moments between partners. But the intimacy of their interaction, the way they seemed so comfortable together, spoke volumes. It wasn't a provocative or scandalous photo, it was as innocent as they come. Yet it was the context that made it damning. Stanley's arm was casually draped around Laura's shoulder, and the two of them seemed engrossed in a private joke. The photo was tagged with the caption, "Best times with the best people." A seemingly innocuous remark that only served to highlight the depth of their connection. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. The evidence of their affair was laid bare, not in secretive messages or fleeting moments of intimacy, but in a snapshot meant to celebrate friendship and good times. The realization was suffocating. The image was a cruel reminder of everything that had been stolen from me. I felt the world tilt on its axis as I absorbed the weight of what I was seeing. It was no longer just about a note or subtle signs, it was an undeniable confirmation of betrayal. Laura had shared her life with Stanley so openly, so freely. The illusion of their harmless interactions was shattered. I stared at the photo for what felt like hours, my mind racing with thoughts of retribution and justice. The more I looked at the image, the clearer it became that this betrayal was not just a personal attack, it was a public one. As the anger within me simmered and boiled, I knew that the path I would take from this moment forward would be shaped by the harsh reality of what I had uncovered. The snapshot was more than a picture, it was a declaration of the new reality I had to face. The hours that followed the discovery of the photo were some of the darkest of my life. I sat in the dim light of my study, the glow from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The image of Laura and Stanley, captured in that seemingly innocent moment, replayed in my mind like a relentless loop. The feelings inside me were a tempest of conflicting emotions. Betrayal was a cold, hard knife twisting in my chest. I felt the sting of every lie, every hidden glance, and every moment of deception. It was as though the very foundation of my existence had been shattered, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. Anger was my constant companion, a roaring inferno that consumed my thoughts. How could Laura do this to me? How could she take something so sacred and tarnish it with such callous disregard? And Stanley, how could he, of all people, who had always been so respectful, turn out to be nothing more than a deceitful opportunist? But amidst the anger and betrayal, there was a deeper struggle, an internal battle between the desire for retribution and the fear of becoming something I despised. I was grappling with the notion of revenge, the idea of using my pain as a weapon against those who had wronged me. It was a path that promised a measure of justice but also threatened to consume me in the process. In the quiet solitude of my study, I began to devise a plan. I knew I needed to act, but the question was how. I wanted to make Stanley pay for the damage he had inflicted on my life, to strip him of everything he held dear, just as he had done to me in his betrayal. But I was also aware that pursuing vengeance could lead me down a dark and perilous road, one where I might lose myself in the process. I reflected on what it meant to seek justice. Was it about making Stanley suffer in the same way I had? Or was it about reclaiming some semblance of control over my shattered world? The more I pondered, the clearer it became that I needed to reclaim my sense of balance and fairness. With each passing minute, the resolution solidified within me. I would not let this betrayal define me or dictate the course of my life. I would use the pain and anger as fuel to craft a plan that would ensure Stanley faced the consequences of his actions. It was the only way to restore some semblance of balance in my world, to make sure that justice, in some form, was served. The path to vengeance was fraught with moral ambiguity and the risk of becoming consumed by the very darkness I sought to dispel. But at this crossroads, I chose the path of retribution, knowing that it was the only way I could begin to mend the wounds inflicted on my soul. I spent the next few days immersed in a labyrinth of strategy and subterfuge. My office became a command center, cluttered with documents, notes, and plans. The dim light of the desk lamp cast an eerie glow over the scene, illuminating the shadows of my thoughts and intentions. I was determined to execute my plan with precision, leaving no room for error. The first step was to scrutinize Stanley's vulnerabilities. I knew that if I was to dismantle his life systematically, I needed to understand where his defenses were weakest. Stanley, with his polished exterior and impeccable reputation, had carefully constructed a facade of invulnerability. But even the most resilient structures have their cracks. I started with his professional life. Stanley was a high-ranking executive at a prestigious firm, a position that granted him considerable power and influence. However, I knew that such positions are often supported by a precarious balance of alliances and compliance. I began to gather information on his interactions with colleagues, the decisions he made, and any questionable practices that could be leveraged. One evening, while reviewing company emails and memos I had access to through mutual contacts, I uncovered a series of questionable transactions and dubious business practices that Stanley had been involved in. It was a web of unethical deals and insider knowledge that could easily become the basis for a scandal. This was a weak link I could exploit. Next, I turned my attention to Stanley's personal life. His public persona was pristine, but I needed to uncover any private skeletons that might be hiding in his closet. I spent hours researching his social media profiles and those of his associates and family. I scrutinized every post, every comment, and every photo for potential ammunition. It wasn't long before I found what I was looking for, a pattern of questionable behavior and connections that could paint Stanley in a less than favorable light. I discovered that he had been involved in a secretive affair with someone outside his marriage, an affair that was both scandalous and damaging. This was the kind of information that could unravel his personal life just as effectively as his professional one. The final piece of the puzzle was to create a strategy for combining these elements into a coherent plan. I drafted detailed scenarios of how to expose the misconduct at work, ensuring that the revelations would lead to a full investigation and potential legal consequences. Simultaneously, I prepared to leak the personal scandal to the media, creating a public relations nightmare that would further tarnish Stanley's reputation. As I worked through each detail, I could feel a cold satisfaction building within me. The plan was taking shape, and with each step, I felt a sense of control returning to my life. But beneath the surface, there was a nagging doubt, a fear that I was becoming the very thing I despised, a puppet master orchestrating the downfall of those who had wronged me. Despite the moral ambiguity of my actions, I pressed on, knowing that this was the path I had chosen. The execution of this plan would not only exact revenge but also serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of betrayal. The time for action was drawing near, and as I finalized my preparations, I felt both the weight of my decisions and a grim sense of satisfaction in the justice I was about to deliver. The day I had been meticulously preparing for had arrived. The plans were set, and all the pieces were in place. Now, it was time to execute the final steps of my scheme. I could feel the tension in the air as I approached the factory, knowing that today would mark the beginning of Stanley Wright's downfall. My first order of business was to ensure that everything was subtly manipulated to create the ideal conditions for an accident. I had arranged for a few key elements to be tampered with, a faulty safety harness and some misaligned equipment. The changes were minor but enough to create a significant risk when combined with the right circumstances. I visited the factory earlier in the day, under the pretense of a routine inspection. It was easy to slip in unnoticed, blending into the crowd of workers who were too absorbed in their tasks to notice me. I took my time, carefully positioning the tampered equipment and adjusting the settings on the machines that Stanley would be using. I made sure to leave a few clues that would point to negligence. I planted a set of fake maintenance logs, detailing non-existent issues with the equipment. The logs were designed to look authentic, complete with forged signatures and dates, to make it seem like the problems had been ignored for some time. With the groundwork laid, I turned my attention to the critical moment. I knew that Stanley's routine involved a high-risk task that required him to work at elevated heights. I ensured that the safety harness he would be using was compromised in a way that would make it look like a failure on the factory's part. The setup was designed to create a catastrophic fall, a scenario that would be devastating both physically and professionally. The next phase was the manipulation of the factory's oversight. I subtly spread rumors about a potential safety audit and the urgency of addressing maintenance issues. This was designed to put pressure on the factory management, ensuring that the investigation into the incident would be focused on perceived negligence rather than the sabotage I had orchestrated. As I finalized the setup, I felt a cold, calculated satisfaction. Each detail had been carefully crafted to ensure that the accident would be both believable and devastating. The timing was crucial, and I had coordinated with enough precision to ensure that Stanley's misfortune would unfold as planned. Finally, as the factory shifted into its usual routine, I took one last look around. The scene was set, the pieces were in place, and now all that remained was to wait and watch as the plan played out. I left the factory with a mix of anticipation and detachment. The path to retribution had been paved, and as I walked away, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The control was mine now, and I had orchestrated every detail to ensure that Stanley Wright would face the consequences of his betrayal. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity and turmoil, each day unfolding like a scene from a meticulously directed play. I kept a careful watch from the shadows, monitoring the fallout from my carefully executed plan. The satisfaction of seeing Stanley's world begin to crumble was tempered by the gnawing feeling of unease that accompanied it. The day of the accident at the factory was chaotic. News reports spread quickly about the incident, painting Stanley as a victim of a tragic mishap. However, the undercurrents of discontent among his colleagues and the whispers of negligence began to grow. I watched as the company launched an internal investigation, which quickly escalated into a public relations nightmare. Stanley's once stellar reputation started to tarnish. He was suspended pending the results of the investigation. And soon enough, the damning details of his alleged negligence were leaked to the press. The company's board, facing mounting pressure, moved to distance itself from Stanley, and he was ultimately dismissed. It was a fall from grace that was as dramatic as it was complete. The impact on Stanley's personal life was equally devastating. The media frenzy that followed the scandal exposed his affair, further eroding his standing. Public opinion turned harsh, and his once privileged life became a series of humiliations and setbacks. It was a sight to behold. A man who had once seemed untouchable now facing the consequences of his actions. As I observed the unfolding events, a part of me relished the justice being served. Yet, another part of me was disturbed by the extent of the fallout. The satisfaction of revenge was tainted by the realization of how far-reaching its effects could be. Through it all, I noticed Laura's growing anxiety. Her demeanor had shifted from casual indifference to palpable unease. The mounting pressure of the scandal was taking its toll on her. She was suddenly more withdrawn, her interactions with me strained and tense. It became increasingly clear that she was beginning to suspect something was amiss. One evening, as I returned home, I found Laura in our living room, scrolling through news updates on her phone. Her face was etched with worry, and she barely glanced up as I entered. I could see the confusion and fear in her eyes, emotions that mirrored the turmoil within me. "Richard," she finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking, do you know anything about why this is happening to Stanley? I mean, do you think there's more to this story?" I forced a neutral expression, masking the surge of guilt and anxiety that threatened to surface. "I don't know, Laura. It's all very sudden and strange. Maybe it's just a coincidence." Her gaze was piercing, as if she was trying to read the truth in my eyes. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the dawning realization that there might be a connection between the unfolding drama and my behavior. It was a dangerous moment, one that could unravel everything I had worked so hard to achieve. As Laura retreated into her thoughts, I was left alone with my own conflicting emotions. The plan was working, but the personal cost was becoming increasingly apparent. The lines between justice and revenge were blurring, and the consequences of my actions were resonating far beyond what I had anticipated. The weeks following Stanley's public downfall were a whirlwind of chaos for both of us. While the fallout from the scandal continued to engulf Stanley, Laura's life began to unravel in parallel, each thread of her existence coming undone with alarming speed. At first, it was the little things. Colleagues who had once greeted her with friendly smiles now avoided her gaze, whispers following her wherever she went. The once vibrant social circles she had navigated with ease began to close in on her. The sting of judgment was palpable, it seeped into every interaction and left her feeling isolated. The ripple effect of Stanley's scandal was relentless. Her professional life suffered as well. The company where she worked became a battleground of gossip and scrutiny. Her position, once secure and prestigious, now felt precarious. The board meetings that had once been routine were now fraught with tension, as whispers about her connection to Stanley began to surface. Her superiors, uncomfortable with the negative publicity, became increasingly critical, making her job nearly untenable. At home, the pressure was even more intense. Laura's demeanor shifted from composed to frazzled, and the facade of our domestic life cracked under the strain. She had always been the center of our home, radiating warmth and control. Now, she seemed overwhelmed, her usually meticulous routines slipping into disarray. One evening, as I came home from a long day, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her face buried in her hands. The sight was a stark contrast to the poised woman I had once known. I could sense her internal struggle, her sense of helplessness growing with each passing day. "Richard, I don't know how much more of this I can take," she said, her voice muffled and strained. "It's like everything is falling apart. The company's not the same, people look at me like I'm part of the problem. I thought I could handle it, but I feel like I'm drowning." I watched her, torn between a sense of detached satisfaction and a pang of guilt. The enormity of her suffering was becoming increasingly apparent, and the realization that my actions had played a significant role in her distress was hard to ignore. The impact of the scandal had seeped into every corner of her life, eroding the stability she had once taken for granted. Her social standing was in tatters, her professional future uncertain, and her sense of security shattered. It was a devastating domino effect, and she was caught in its relentless path. Despite the internal conflict I felt, I knew I had to maintain my composure. The facade of normalcy was important, both for my sanity and for the plans I had yet to execute. But each day, as I watched Laura struggle, the weight of my actions grew heavier. The consequences of revenge were no longer abstract, they were tangible, affecting the person I had once held dear. As I observed the toll on Laura, I was faced with the stark reality of what my quest for retribution had wrought. The lines between justice and vengeance blurred, and the personal cost of my actions became a poignant reminder of the complexities of human emotions and the destructive power of betrayal. The oppressive silence in our home was a stark contrast to the once lively and harmonious atmosphere we had shared. Laura had been increasingly withdrawn, her once bright eyes now shadowed with a deep sense of anguish. The vibrant woman who used to fill our home with laughter was now a ghost of her former self, haunted by the weight of her own choices. One evening, I found her sitting alone in the dimly lit living room, the television playing softly in the background. She was staring blankly at the screen, but her mind seemed miles away. The exhaustion etched on her face was palpable, and I could see the torment in her eyes. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling, "I've been thinking a lot lately. About everything that's happened, about what I've done." Her words were barely more than a whisper, but they carried a heavy weight. I sat down beside her, my heart heavy with the knowledge that my actions had led us to this point. "What's on your mind?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "It's just," she paused, her voice catching. "I never imagined things would turn out like this. I thought I could have everything, Stanley. My job, my life. But now, I've lost it all. The scandal, the judgment, it's like my entire world has collapsed." Her admission was a raw, painful acknowledgement of her reality. The once clear lines of her ambition and desires had blurred into a chaotic mess of regret and sorrow. She was facing the undeniable truth that her infidelity had set off a chain reaction of destruction that she could neither control nor escape. "I never wanted this," she continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought I was just making a mistake, that I could handle it. But now, I see the consequences. I see how my actions have hurt not just Stanley, but everyone around me, including you. I'm not just losing my job or my reputation, I'm losing myself." Her voice cracked with the weight of her realization. It was as though she had been living in a dream, one where her choices were insignificant and the consequences were abstract. Now, the harsh reality had shattered that illusion, leaving her with the full weight of her actions. I watched her struggle with her guilt and regret. It was painful to witness, knowing that the devastation she was experiencing was directly tied to the plan I had set in motion. Yet, as I saw her pain, I couldn't help but feel a complex mix of emotions, guilt, anger, and a reluctant understanding of the human condition. "I'm so sorry, Richard," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I was selfish, and now I'm paying the price. I wish I could turn back time and make different choices." Her words were a desperate plea for redemption, a wish for a different outcome. I could see the depth of her remorse, the genuine sorrow for the havoc her actions had wreaked. It was a stark contrast to the cold determination that had driven my own choices. As I looked at Laura, I felt the full weight of our shared tragedy. The quest for vengeance had come at a tremendous cost, not just to Stanley but to the very person I had once loved. The psychological toll on Laura was profound. and her anguish was a harsh reminder of the complexities of human actions and the far-reaching impact of betrayal. At that moment, I was forced to confront the harsh truth. The pursuit of revenge had not only damaged Stanley's life but had also driven Laura to the brink of psychological collapse. The lines between justice and retribution had become painfully blurred, and the consequences were far more devastating than I had ever anticipated. The day was overcast, the sky mirroring the turmoil that had enveloped our lives. Laura had requested a meeting, her voice tinged with a desperation that I hadn't heard in a long time. As I walked into our living room, I found her sitting on the edge of the sofa, her face drawn and pale. "Richard, we need to talk," she began, her voice wavering. "Please, just hear me out. I know things have been terrible, but I need you to understand." I took a seat across from her, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on me. My decision to file for divorce was already made, and the paperwork was drafted and ready. The idea of confronting the mess we had found ourselves in was excruciating. But I needed to see this through. "I've been thinking a lot," Laura continued, her eyes brimming with tears. "I see now how my actions have led to this. I know I've made mistakes, and I'm so sorry for everything. But I want to fix things. I want to save our marriage, if you'll just give me a chance." Her plea was heartfelt, and I could see the depth of her remorse. Yet, despite the pain in her eyes, I remained resolute. "Laura," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I've already made up my mind. The damage has been done, and I can't undo it. I can't stay in a marriage where trust has been irreparably broken." The look of shock and hurt on her face was almost too much to bear. She had been grappling with her demons, and now she faced the collapse of the life she had known. "But Richard," she said, her voice cracking, "isn't there anything we can do? We can go to counseling and try to work things out. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." I shook my head, the finality of my decision weighing on me. "It's not just about counseling or trying to fix things. It's about the fact that I can't move past the betrayal and the subsequent fallout. My decision to file for divorce is about reclaiming some semblance of control and moving forward." The conversation was draining, an emotional battleground where the scars of our relationship were laid bare. Laura's pleas fell on ears that had already closed off, and as she left the room in tears, I felt a profound sense of loss and resolve. The divorce proceedings began shortly after, and the process was as public as it was painful. The media latched onto the story, fueling the flames of scandal that surrounded both Laura and Stanley. The public scrutiny was relentless, adding yet another layer of torment to an already harrowing situation. The courtroom became a stage for our tragedy, with every detail of our private lives being dissected and reported. The once private wounds were exposed to the world, exacerbating the reputational damage that had already been inflicted on both Laura and Stanley. Each hearing brought a fresh wave of public judgment and criticism, further eroding their standing and adding to the emotional strain. Laura's life continued to spiral, her professional reputation in tatters and her dignity battered by the relentless media attention. Her once secure career became a casualty of the scandal, and the judgment of others only intensified her suffering. She was forced to navigate a world where every move was scrutinized, every misstep magnified. As the divorce proceeded, the emotional toll on both of us was evident. The finality of the separation was a stark reminder of the damage that had been inflicted and the lives that had been irrevocably changed. The pursuit of revenge had led to a cascade of consequences that had reached far beyond the original intent. In the aftermath, as the public scrutiny waned and the legal proceedings drew to a close, I was left to confront the reality of what had transpired. The journey of revenge had exacted a heavy toll, and the once clear lines between justice and vengeance had become a complex, painful labyrinth of human emotions and consequences. The once proud figure of Stanley Wright had been reduced to a shadow of his former self. The accident at the factory had left him with severe injuries, physical and emotional, that would forever alter the course of his life. The medical reports were a litany of grim news: broken bones, spinal damage, and chronic pain that would require extensive treatment and rehabilitation. As I followed the aftermath of the incident from a distance, the stark reality of Stanley's situation became increasingly apparent. The once bustling executive had been forced into a world of constant medical appointments and grueling therapy sessions. His body, once robust and capable, now betrayed him with each step and movement. The pain was a constant companion, a reminder of the fragile nature of human health and the unforgiving consequences of a single moment of sabotage. Stanley's daily life had become a series of appointments with specialists, physical therapists, and pain management experts. The luxurious lifestyle he had enjoyed was replaced by a reality of medical bills and a diminishing ability to participate in the high-profile career he once dominated. The medical setbacks had not only stripped him of his professional identity but had also created a financial burden that was suffocating. The rehabilitation process was grueling, a harsh regimen of exercises and treatments designed to salvage what could be salvaged. The once confident executive struggled with the physical limitations imposed by his injuries, grappling with the realization that his life had irrevocably changed. The loss of mobility and the constant pain eroded his sense of self-worth, leaving him isolated and despondent. His personal life, too, was in disarray. The affair that had been exposed now seemed like a distant, irrelevant footnote compared to the overwhelming challenges of his health. His relationships with family and friends became strained as they struggled to cope with the changing dynamics and the emotional toll of his condition. The once respected figure who had commanded attention now found himself largely forgotten, a victim of both the scandal and the ensuing health crisis. As I observed Stanley's struggle, I was confronted with the full extent of the consequences that had followed my actions. The physical and emotional toll on him was a harsh reminder of the devastating impact of revenge. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now grappling with the harsh reality of his vulnerability. In his solitude, Stanley had little choice but to confront the reality of his situation. The road to recovery was long and fraught with uncertainty, and every step forward was met with the shadow of the past. The accident had stripped him of his professional success and inflicted a deep, lasting pain that would define the remainder of his life. The finality of his situation was a sobering reflection of the damage that had been wrought. Revenge had claimed its toll, and the cost was visible in the suffering etched on Stanley's face and the stark reality of his new, painful existence. The pursuit of justice had left behind a trail of destruction, and as I watched Stanley's struggle, I was faced with the undeniable truth of the far-reaching consequences of my own decisions. The courtroom was a stark, imposing space, its cold, unforgiving walls echoing with the weight of our tragedy. Laura and I found ourselves face to face in this sterile environment, a setting that underscored the gravity of what had transpired. The proceedings were a somber reminder of the reality we had created, and the tension between us was palpable as we prepared for yet another hearing. Laura's demeanor was a mixture of anxiety and resignation. Her once confident posture was now slumped, her eyes hollowed by weeks of relentless stress and introspection. As we waited for the proceedings to begin, I could see the torment etched on her face. She was a woman who had come to a profound realization about the impact of her actions. The moment that shifted the focus was unexpected. A brief recess in the proceedings provided an opportunity for Laura and me to converse in a quieter, more private corner of the courthouse. The usual legal jargon and procedural formalities were momentarily set aside as we faced each other with raw, unfiltered honesty. "Richard," Laura began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I've come to understand how my actions have gone beyond just destroying our marriage." I nodded, my own emotions a turbulent mix of bitterness and reluctant sympathy. "What do you mean? It's not just us," she continued, her voice trembling. "It's what happened to Stanley. I've seen the reports and the medical updates. I didn't realize the extent of his suffering until now. The injury, the ongoing pain, the impact on his life, it's all so much worse than I imagined." Her eyes were filled with tears, the depth of her realization cutting through the fog of her guilt. It was clear that she had come to grasp the full ramifications of her choices, not just for us but for Stanley as well. "I never wanted this," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was just making a mistake, but I see now that it's so much more. I can't believe how far-reaching the consequences have been. It's not just about us anymore. It's about a man's life being irrevocably changed." I watched as Laura struggled with her guilt and anguish. The recognition of the far-reaching impact of her infidelity was a bitter pill to swallow. The realization that her actions had led to a cascade of suffering and ruin was evident in her expression. "I'm so sorry, Richard," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I never imagined it would come to this. I'm sorry for everything I've done, for the pain I've caused you, and for what has happened to Stanley." Her apology was genuine, but the damage had already been done. The process of untangling the mess we had created was fraught with difficulty, and the court proceedings were a stark reminder of the personal and public consequences of our actions. As we parted ways, I felt the weight of her realization and the toll it had taken on her. The courtroom had become a stage for our tragedy, a place where the full extent of our mistakes was laid bare. The path to recovery, both for us and for Stanley, was a long and uncertain one. The consequences of betrayal were harsh and unyielding, and the echoes of our choices would resonate long after the final gavel fell. In the end, the courthouse was not just a place of legal proceedings but a crucible where the harsh truths of our actions were confronted. Laura's realization of the broader impact of her decisions was a sobering reminder of the complexity and severity of the human condition. The dust of our legal battles had long since settled, but the scars left by our actions remained. The courthouse, once a battleground for our vendettas, had given way to the quiet, somber reality of our separate lives. The final gavel had fallen, marking the end of an era of turmoil, but the aftermath was anything but peaceful. Laura and I had taken different paths, each carrying our burdens. Our marriage, once vibrant and filled with promise, had been reduced to a painful memory. The choices we made, driven by betrayal and revenge, had carved deep fissures into the fabric of our lives. Laura's life, once filled with social engagements and professional success, had been dismantled piece by piece. The public scandal had stripped her of her career and her standing among peers. She moved through her days with a heavy heart, the weight of her guilt and the loss of everything she once held dear casting long shadows over her existence. Her once privileged life had become a constant reminder of the consequences of her choices. The weight of her actions was a heavy burden, one she carried with a mix of sorrow and regret. I, too, faced my reckoning. The satisfaction of seeing Stanley's life unravel had been fleeting. The realization of the human cost of my actions gnawed at me, leaving me with a profound sense of unease. The pursuit of revenge had not only shattered Stanley's world but had also led to the destruction of my connections and the deepening of my isolation. The echoes of my actions were a constant reminder of the destructive power of vengeance. Our paths diverged into separate journeys of reflection and sorrow. Laura sought to rebuild her life from the ruins, grappling with her sense of guilt and loss. Her attempts to find solace were often met with the harsh reality of her circumstances, leaving her in a state of continual regret. For me, the road was one of introspection and the search for redemption. The realization of the destruction I had wrought became a heavy burden. I found myself wandering through a landscape marred by the choices I had made, struggling to reconcile the pursuit of justice with the human cost it had entailed. The story of our lives had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of betrayal and the destructive nature of revenge. The pursuit of vengeance had brought about a reckoning far beyond what any of us had anticipated. The once clear lines of morality and justice had been blurred, leaving us to navigate the aftermath of our actions. As I looked back on the chain of events that had led us to this point, I was left with a somber understanding of the moral at the heart of our story, the destructive power of revenge and the way it can consume everything in its path. The cycle of betrayal and retribution had left its mark on all of us, and the echoes of our choices would reverberate long after the final chapter had been written. In the end, the story closed on a note of melancholy, a testament to the painful truths we had uncovered and the harsh realities of the paths we had chosen.